Right, let's wrap this little series up by just polishing up the last couple of bits. It's not going to be a complete game, there's still going to be a bit of a way to go, but that's for you to research. So I'm just going to show you how to spawn some additional asteroids when one's destroyed. We might put a cheeky little particle effect on the player and just stop additional asteroids spawning once the player's died. So a couple of things to cover and then we'll leave it at that. You can go back to Unity's videos to figure out how to do scores and so on. So I'm going to start by making another asteroid prefab. And to do that I've brought in a second asteroid. So just grab another sprite. You can use the original one. It's just good to have some sort of way to tell them apart. So I'm going to bring that in and I'm going to scale it down. It's not going to be quite as big as the other one. But apart from that, it's going to be very similar to the other one. So it's going to need some form of collider. So let's put a circle collider on there, scale it in ever so slightly. That's also going to need a 2D rigid body. It's going to need to be tagged as an asteroid and it's going to need to be on the asteroid's layer just so it adopts all the physics stuff so it won't collide with other asteroids, and it's still tagged as an asteroid so that it can kill the player. So that's all good. It also needs the asteroid controller script. So let's drag that on. And it also needs the movement wrap. That should be everything, I think. We might want to change the speed, so maybe these second asteroids move a bit quicker, so they could maybe go at 1.5 instead. Yeah, why not? And I think we're good to go there. Just have a quick glance through. Yeah, that's okay. So let's rename that. Let's call that asteroid 2 in the hierarchy there. And I'm going to drag it into the prefabs folder. So we've now got this second asteroid that we can spawn in when the first one's destroyed. So let's delete that one from the stage scene. Go to the asteroid script. So in the asteroid controller, we're now going to edit this slightly. And it was very deliberately set up to support this second spawn because in the start function, we don't put it in charge of where it spawns. The spawner script, the spawn control script, decides where the first asteroids are spawned, but we could have put that in here. This could have been controlled by the asteroid. It could have picked a random place in the world. It could have set its rotation and all that stuff, but that would make it much trickier to do this follow-on. So this one's nicely set up so that we can just spawn the follow-on. And we're going to do that from inside the asteroid controller. So the asteroid controller is in turn going to spawn more asteroids when it's blown up. So that all happens in here. When it's shot by a bullet, it's removed and it destroys the bullet as well. But just before we do that, we're going to spawn in 2 additional asteroids and we're going to offset them at 60 degrees from each other. It's also where the importance of using the x-axis. So just to demonstrate one more time with the spaceship here, the x-axis is actually the direction that the angle faces. When at 0 degrees we move along the x-axis, and so that's why really your images should face to the right, and we're going to make use of that in here. So when the asteroid is destroyed, we're going to figure out what angle it's facing by just using a little bit of trigonometry that I'm not going to dwell on too long. If you're in my classes, we will go through it properly in time. If you're online, watching online, just go and read up a little bit on trigonometry for this line. It is just one line of code for now. And it's going to be a floating point number. We're going to make a float, and this is going to be the angle that the asteroid's currently moving. It's going to equal mathf, so we're using the mathf class, dot atan2. This gives us the arc tangent, the second arc tangent. There's 2 different ways of getting it. One, atan without the 2, only lets us really accurately work between minus 90 degrees and 90 degrees, whereas we want full 360 rotation, so we're using atan2. And then in brackets it wants a y and an x, and this is the imaginary opposite side and adjacent side of a right-angled triangle. So if you know anything about trigonometry, you know that a tangent is to do with the relationship of the opposite side and the adjacent side. So the tangent of an angle is the opposite side divided by the adjacent. It gives you the ratio of the 2. But we don't need to dwell on that. We just know that it's going to give us the angle based on those 2. And this y and x are going to be based on our rigid body's velocity. So the first one is going to be the y velocity. So we'll do rv dot velocity dot y, and the second one is going to be the x, so rb dot velocity dot x, and that will give us the angle, but it will give us the angle in radians, and a radian is just a different way of measuring an angle. We traditionally use degrees, so 0 to 360, whereas in radians it goes from 0 to 2 pi, so the number pi is used to work with circles. And if 360 degrees is 2 pi, 180 degrees is just pi radians. But we don't need to worry too much about that again, because there is a little handy conversion number. So I'm going to multiply this radian angle by mathf dot rad to deg. So there's a little number we can use there that will change this radian value into a degrees value that we can use. So that now gives us an angle variable that has the rigid body's current direction as degrees, and then we can use that to position these two new asteroids. So we're going to use instantiate twice here. So we're going to instantiate two different asteroids and send them on 60 degree offsets from our current heading. And then we start the initiate function, and then instantly we hit a bit of a snag because we don't have a link to the prefab. So what every asteroid is going to hold is a potential link to the next set of asteroids it's going to spawn. But obviously not every set of asteroids is going to spawn more, otherwise we'd be caught in this endless cycle where every asteroid spawned two more, so you could never actually get rid of them. You'd just be making more work for yourself by shooting them. So we're going to have a little safeguard that only spawns them if there's any to be spawned. Up at the top, to hold a reference to the next asteroid, let's make a public game object. So we're going to hold a reference to a prefab, and we'll call that next asteroid. I'm going at quite a rate of knots here. I just want to get this video finished so it's out there and you can get back to Unity stuff. So here we're going to instantiate this next asteroid. So let's do next asteroid, comma, and the position is going to be where we currently are, so where this asteroid is before it gets blown up, transform.position, and then the rotation we've just figured out there, that's the Z rotation, bear in mind, because we're working in 2D. So we want Quaternion.Euler, and then in brackets we want no X, no Y, and then we want angle in the Z. And that gives us a new asteroid on the current direction, but we don't want to do that. We want to offset it by 60. So let's do minus 60 there. And then we'll copy the whole line, paste it underneath, and this time change it to plus 60. So we'll have one asteroid minus 60 degrees, one asteroid plus 60. So we get like a V-shaped change in direction when we blow an asteroid up. Now let's just save that and select our first asteroid prefab in the project folder. And when it's updated, we should see we get this next asteroid prompt in the component. So let's just drag asteroid 2 into that one. And in asteroid 2, we'll leave that empty. So at the moment, this is going to cause a bit of a problem. The game's not going to like this. When we shoot one of these second asteroids, it's not going to know what to spawn, so it'll kick up a bit of a fuss there. Let's just try it out. So I should be able to shoot the first one when it spawns, and if I've got my aim, which I don't. Right, so it's split and gravity's still affecting. I knew I'd forget something. It's bound to happen. So on the second asteroid, let's put the gravity scale to 0. I'm sure some of you spotted that and you were laughing all the way through that code bit at a very unfunny thing. Right, there we go, it's split. So it's split off in 60 degrees. Let's shoot that one. That also does the same. And if we shoot one of these second ones, notice there straight away at the bottom we've got this error. So the variable next asteroid of the asteroid controller hasn't been assigned, and it doesn't like that. So we need to make some sort of allowance in the code for not having a next asteroid. So we're only going to spawn 2 more asteroids if there's anything to spawn. So we'll ask if brackets next asteroid, and that will simply ask if this next asteroid exists. And then underneath the instantiates, let's put the curly bracket in. I was hoping it would tab them in, but no. So let's just tab them in so we know that they belong in that if. So now, if the next asteroid does exist, we'll figure out the angle we're heading, and then we'll spawn 2 new ones. So that's okay. Let's just try that. So now, shooting the first one should spawn 2, and shooting those 2 should just destroy them. Come on. There we go. So let's shoot that one, and let's try and pick off. There we go. So that worked. Oh, look at that. Perfect aim. And that worked pretty well. No errors. Everything's gone, and we're not overrun with asteroids. So that's one job. Let's just quickly edit the code so that it stops spawning asteroids when the player's been killed, because we don't want to just flood the screen with asteroids once we've gone. So this is slightly different. This isn't something we've done, but in the spawn controller here, what we'll do is when the player's gone, when there is no player in the scene, we will delete this bit of script. Not the full object, we don't want to delete the camera. This spawn controller is attached to the camera, but we can delete this component from it. Just to make this a bit easier, because we're going to use the names from the hierarchy here, I'm going to finally rename my ship. Let's call it player. It probably should have been a prefab long ago, but for now it's just a game object and it's called player, and we're going to make use of that name, so this is something a bit new in here. So at the top of the update, before we worry about spawning asteroids, we're going to try and get a reference to the player. So let's make a game object variable, capital G for this one, game object player lowercase equals, and here we're going to use game object dot find, so we can look for an object in the scene with a given name, and the name of it here is player. I've just renamed it. So we're looking for a game object in the scene called player. And just as we did a second ago where we asked if next asteroid exists, we're also now going to ask if this player exists. So if player, then whatever. But we actually want the opposite of this. So we could put equals equals null. So that would mean if it doesn't exist. But we could also put an exclamation mark in front of player. So if not player. If there's no player, let's figure out what we're going to do. We're going to destroy this object. So let's just destroy bracket this. You might also want to do a return, so you could have curly brackets here just to stop the rest of the function happening, but I'm not going to worry about that. Having one little extra asteroid at the exact moment we die isn't too bad. So hopefully now, if we look for a player and we don't find one, we're going to destroy this particular component, not the full camera, just this component. Let's see how that goes. Give it a try and let's deliberately die and see if the spawning stops. So if I fly into that one, hopefully now we've got 2 asteroids. If we wait for a few seconds just to make sure that has happened, we're not getting any more. Let's just flick to scene view and check. So there should no longer be a spawn controller on the camera, and there isn't. You can see the component's gone. If we skip out of play mode, it comes back, so that's good. The game is working as intended there. Nice little 2 extra bits, 2 lines of code there just to see if a player currently exists. You could actually condense that into 1 line if you want to, but yeah, that will stop the spawning once the game's effectively finished. Last bit, I'm going to put a little particle effect on the spaceship, because why not? Particles are pretty cool. And to do that, I'm going to go up to the top, choose game object, and I'm going to make a particle system. And straight away, we get this nice little visual thing. That's quite cool, as it is. But it doesn't look right, definitely doesn't look like the engine of a ship. It's going the wrong way, it's too big, it's the wrong colour, all sorts of stuff is going wrong. But we've got a lot we can customise. Notice in your inspector, there's all sorts of stuff going on now. We've got loads of options. So I'm not going to dwell on all of them. There is quite a handy particle system tutorial on the Unity site that goes through pretty much everything. But I'm just going to change some of the key bits. So the start lifetime, they last too long. I don't want them to last 5 seconds. 2 seconds is probably too long, but we'll go for that. So 2 seconds. They're going too fast as well. Considering the scale of our game, they're moving far too quickly. So I'm going to drop that down quite significantly, maybe to 0.5. So that's a bit better. They're too big. So the start size is far too big. Let's maybe drop that to 0.2. That might even be a bit small, so maybe 0.3 or 4, 0.4. Rotation is irrelevant for these because they're just circles. They're going to look the same. But then the colour, we don't want them white. We could set just a different colour here. You could just click on the white and pick something a bit more appropriate, like an orangey colour. But what I actually want is to have it random between two. So I'm going to click the drop down at the end. And I'm going to have a random between two colours. And this now gives us this second box. So let's choose a slightly redder colour for that second one, just for a bit more fire. So we've got a slight light orange and then a slightly red orange. Gravity is irrelevant in this one. Inherit velocity lets us take a bit of the velocity from the movement of the particle emitter itself, so that might be useful. Let's take 20% of its current velocity, and the simulation space is important. I'm going to show you why in a second. So just to illustrate that, I'm going to grab this particle system and I'm going to drop it into the player. So the player becomes the particle system's parent, which means it will follow it around. And if we play the game, particles now follow the player, but notice they also rotate with the player, they move with the player, and that's what this simulation space relates to. We don't want them to follow the parent like that, we want them to be left behind. So we're going to make them simulate world space. They're going to move based on where they spawn, but then from then on they're in world space. They don't spawn and follow the parent around. So now when we spawn them, we leave them where they are. That's already much better. Still not quite right, but it's okay. What else have we got there? We want them to play. Max particles. We're probably never going to reach the 1,000 mark, so we don't need to worry about that. Let's now look at, I'm going to skip over the emission for a second, but notice that's enabled. We want them to emit. We also have this shape, and we are going to look at that. So notice when I click on shape, straight away we get this blue shape. And if I flick out of 2D mode, we can see it's actually a cone. You could guess from that by seeing the word cone there, so you can actually change the shape if you want to. I'm going to keep it as a cone. I'm just going to edit it slightly. So I'm going to start by rotating it because it's currently going the wrong way. So I'm going to rotate it around there so it's at 180 degrees, and I'm going to shrink it in drastically. So we could probably do this in 2D. It's not quite in the right place either, so just back in 2D mode. I'm going to move it so it's where the back of the ship would be. I'm going to, I think the shape's okay there, it's not too bad. Yeah, that's okay. Just very quickly in 3D view, in the 3D view, I want to move it so it is definitely behind the ship. I've got lucky there, it is, but you might want to just really exaggerate that so the particles don't come through the spaceship. When you flip back to 2D, it's not going to have a massive effect other than them not coming over the top, which is good. So that's the shape of the emitter. Play around with that if you want to. You can do a lot more with that. There's a few other bits I want to turn on that are currently off. So for example, the size over the lifetime. Actually, I don't want them to just stay one size and then disappear because it looks a bit odd. I want them to shrink down to nothing. So I'm going to enable size over lifetime and expand it. And I'm going to click on this curve. This is an animation curve that's currently unset. It's set to be 1 the whole time. And down at the bottom, you can actually manually draw this if you want to play around with these points. But I'm going to take a preset here that starts at full. So this one here starts up at the top and it arcs down to 0. So that would gradually shrink the particle out to 0 size. And you can see instantly that's a much nicer effect. So I'm going to leave that one. Feel free to play around with it. So I'm quite happy with that. And what else do we need? There's nothing much else to turn on, so I'm going to leave that. You might want to look into the renderer where you can actually give it an image instead of being the base particle. I don't really have time for that. I'm now going to play around with the emission. So at the moment it's just emitting constantly. You can change the rate. You could emit much faster, so ramp that up to 40 and it's an instantly more powerful effect. 40 is maybe a bit high, let's drop it to 20. And you can play around with how it's done. So instead of just constantly doing it over time, we could swap it to distance, which is actually quite a nice effect for our game. If I flick it to distance and then play the game, notice that when I move, particles kick in, and when we're not moving so quickly, the effect is lessened. Now that's not bad, but really when I'm just floating through space like that, my engine's not on, I'm not telling the spaceship to move, so the engine shouldn't really be kicking out particles. And there's also one major flaw with it. When we wrap to the screen, you see we get that big flick of particles. That's because we've traversed a very big distance there. We've warped across the screen, and the particle system is saying, hang on, they've travelled a very long way, let's fill in that gap. So while it's a nice effect, it's not particularly useful to us here. So we're going to simulate that in code instead. We're going to put some code into the player that's going to affect the emission rate of this particle system based on the vertical axis of the input. So I'm going to swap the emission back to time, and then I'm going to jump into the player code. So in the player controller, we're going to use this input.getAxis vertical to control the emission rate of our particle system. And to do it, we need a reference to the particle system here, like we've got with the bullet prefab, like we did with the asteroid prefab before. We need to reference that particular particle system. So let's have a link to it. We could actually grab it with code, but I'm going to do it where we just drag it in through the inspector. So we're going to have a public particle system. Make sure you get particle system, we don't want any of the other ones. Particle system, and let's just call it particles. So that's now asking us for a reference to our particle system. Let's go and pass that in. So provided I did save the script there, which I hopefully did. Let's just select the player, and where are we? Yeah, you can see here it wants this particle system. So let's grab the particle system, throw it into that slot, and we're done. So that's okay. Now back in the code, we want to remember just so we've still got some control out in the inspector, we want to remember the emission rate of the particles as the game starts. So that will still be our maximum rate, and we'll keep that private. There's no reason for that to appear in the inspector. So we'll have a private float, it could probably be an int, that just remembers the emission rate. Spelled properly though. Emission rate. And that's not going to be set to anything at the start, but then in the start function we'll grab it. So emission rate equals, and then we access our particle system, particles.emission rate. So the emission rate variable we're storing is going to match the particle system's emission rate when we start the game. And now down here, when we actually move, we can use this input.getAxis to affect the emission rate. So I'm just going to copy the input.getAxis bit, so it saves me pasting it all out, typing it all again. And then I'm going to do particles.emission rate equals paste, so our vertical axis multiplied by our emission rate. So the starting emission rate is going to be multiplied by the current axis, vertical axis. So if we're holding up, our vertical axis is going to be 1, which means we would get the full effect of our emission rate. If we're not holding up, the vertical axis will be 0, and we won't get any particles. And if we're in reverse, it'll be -1, which would give us no particles as well, hopefully, unless we get a negative amount of particles, which would be a bit weird. Let's go backwards, we get nothing. Go forwards, and there we go. We have particles. So only now, when I'm holding up, will particles spawn. And that's not too shabby. Play around with it, spend a bit of time making it look nice. You might want to make your own particle sprite that you can replace the base with. I did have one, I think, in the asset list that I'd taken from the Kenny assets, but we'll leave it, I think, there. So the game's not totally finished, but you've definitely got a nice base to build on. Add a scoring system and make use of all of Unity's tutorials for that. I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully I'll see you in some other Unity videos, because I do like it, but it seems a bit futile when they've got everything covered. We'll see how it goes. Bye for now.